Thanks for that wonderful introduction. My name is Ben Joseph. I'm the head of archival processing at Northwestern University Libraries. And what that means is I lead a team of archivists and non-exempt staff who provide arrangement and description services for all of what we call distinctive collections, which is more than just archives and special collections. Little component libraries that also have their own special collections stuff. So I also, as part of this group, administer ArchivesSpace, which is kind of in conjunction with the Metadata Services Unit at the library, which is basically the cataloging department. Today I'm going to tell you how to get resource records from ArchivesSpace into Primo without using Alma and without using a plugin. And Kevin is unfortunately going to play a surprise to him. I guess not unfortunately, maybe fortunately. He plays a major role in this presentation because the idea was, so there was some discussion on the ArchivesSpace list recently about, hey, how do we get records into Alma or into other discovery layers? And he sent a message to the list saying, hey, check out this cool plugin that I made that shoots MARC records into Alma. And so I went to our metadata specialist person, Karen Miller, who had already set up a workflow, which is kind of this, and said, why don't we do what Kevin is doing? Because this seems really easy and really intuitive and makes a lot of sense. And here's what he said. If this slide loads here. Oh, okay. So she said, it looks like they're pushing a MARC record into Alma, where it then gets automatically published into Primo. We're going directly to Primo now. We could do this, but there's no way to have separate fields for display and searching in Alma, so we lose the ability to do a full text search, because now the full text of the finding date goes into a PNX search field that is not displayed. So I said, that sounds good. What exactly does that mean? Because I don't really know much about PNX, right? She then went on to explain like our ideal situation and the reason that we do it this way, which is here. Okay, so here's our ideal situation. We want to have ArchivesSpace as the database of record, which means we don't want to put all that stuff into Alma if we don't have to, because then it's in two places, and there is kind of like a, we don't want the catalogers to change our archival records. I don't know, that's just a local convention. So we're going into PNX, which is Primo Normalized XML, and we can put the entirety of a record into a search field and make it full text searchable in Primo. PNX records have 3 separate elements for display, sorting, and searching. So we can take our original metadata and use it in different ways depending on where in the PNX it goes. So this helps us reuse existing metadata, which we're very keen on doing. Okay, so here's a really simplified sort of flowchart that I created using arrows in PowerPoint. On the left is Kevin's workflow, I think, but he's going to talk more about that. And on the right is what we've been doing. It's Kevin and versus Carrot, basically. So on the left, the plugin that goes into Alma. You start off in ArchivesSpace, you go into Alma, and then you go into Primo. But actually, what's happening is you're going from ArchivesSpace into MARC, and then into Alma, and then into Primo. Is that right? Is that what's happening? Okay, awesome. So on the left, we're going from ArchivesSpace into Primo, but actually it's ArchivesSpace to EAD to PNX into Primo, which seems like a more roundabout way of doing things. And then after Karen had described this entire process to me, she then said, oh, actually, we're also going into mods about halfway through. And said, oh, okay, this sounds way too complicated now. The reason The reason being, as it was explained to me, was that when you're going from EAD to PNX, there are a number of many-to-one relationships that have to be resolved along the way. And PNX is a lot clunkier to do that in. I'm told mods is easier, and we're more of a mods shop, I guess, as far as the cataloging department goes. So once you've funneled everything into mods, it's a lot easier to then have those one-to-one relationships carry over into PNX. So even though it looks more complicated, or maybe it is. So this, you definitely can't see this, but this is a catalog record in our instance of Primo. And even if you can't see it, that's fine, because I'm going to tell you what's here. So there's a link to the finding it here. There is subject, headings, and authorities, publisher, language, summary. The summary is coming from the abstract field in the finding aid. But then if you look behind this at the PNX, oh, even I can't read this. Okay. So what you're going to see is there's going to be those three display searching and sorting fields, which are here. And up at the top for the display, you're going to see, so if I can remember what's actually being shown there. So you've got like publisher, language, and so forth, kind of administrative front-end stuff. And then there's a field called LDS02, which is what's being mapped in from the abstract. That's what's displaying. Yeah, that's that. And then down here, if you're, I guess actually if you're looking at the slides that you got via email, you'll see that there are a number of fields which is called description. And those again are like different fields that are being mapped in from the finding aid. So the first one is abstract. The second one is biopist, then scope content, separated material, processing info, and then the last one is just sort of like an aggregation of everything else in the finding aid, which includes the container list. So literally every single archival object and component, box, folder, item, it's all in this description field here. So it's just kind of a repeating field wherein we've got every single word in the finding aid. We find that useful because it allows full text searching to happen in Primo. On the other hand, it doesn't necessarily tell the user what reason this record is being returned for. So if they do a search for something that's very deep in the record, it's not going to show up until they click on the finding aid link and then go to the finding aid and do the search again. So if they're not being assisted in any way by one of the research services staff, it could be a little tricky. Okay, so how does this work? How does this happen? So we start off using a read-only ODBC connection to our production ArchivesSpace instance, which is hosted at Atlas. And we run a query. This happens once a month to list all resource records in ArchivesSpace that were published or are already published and had at least one component edited in any repository in the past month. So this is just something that we have a reminder set for, like the first of every month we'll do this. Then we'll export EAD from ArchivesSpace for each resource record on that list. And we'll run each EAD record through an XSLT transformation into mods. And then we'll do it again with the mods into PNX. And these XSLT sheets, I don't have them in here, but if you'd like them, we can send them to you. Just send an email. We're happy to share them. It just didn't make it into this presentation. Then we'll compress those PNX records into one tar.gz file and ingest it into Primo. And the records then display in Primo after the regular database reindex, which I think is like every hour or 15 minutes or something like that. I can't remember. Okay, I think this is actually on a timer, and that was perfect. Okay. Oh, right.
I'm looking at your thumb and pressing.
Oh, thank you very much. It's just kind of happening by magic. That's amazing. Okay. So there are pros and cons to this approach. I didn't actually press the button. So one of the pros is that it is full text searchable. Each record is, there's no plugin required, and this will leverage existing staff expertise that you may have. I mean, if you're using Primo and ArchivesSpace, you've probably got a Primo person and an ArchivesSpace person, and they could probably figure it out. It's customizable, so you don't have to do it this way. If you don't want to put the entire container list into the record, you don't have to. You can just do series descriptions, for instance, if you want. And this also leaves ArchivesSpace as the database of record, so you don't have a record in two places. Cons are that this is a manual process. It's not automated. We just have to remember to do it. Records don't go into OCLC or WorldCat. I know at University of Denver, all those finding records are in WorldCat, I think, right? Okay, I won't. Okay, well I won't. Right? We don't share finding of records with WorldCat for whatever reason. We send them all to Archive Grid, so that was like a local decision that was made. So it's actually not a huge con for us. But we do have separate workflows for records that were published and unpublished, right? So that's just something we have to remember. Like we published a record in ArchivesSpace, and it gets hooked into this process, and then the donor comes back and says, "Hey, hold on a second, that's not supposed to be live yet." We'll be, "Oh, sorry," then we'll turn it off and wait for the big fanfare to occur. Then we have to remember to tell Karen to take it out of Primo, right? Because there's no process for that. And if Karen leaves, we're in trouble because she's the person who does this. And even though I feel confident articulating this process, I've never actually done it. So, an extra pro is that this works great with Aeon. We're currently in the middle of implementing Aeon right now, and what we've discovered is that getting that request button to show up in Primo for the right records, the right time for the correct holdings can be tricky, and so not having our collection level archival finding of records in Alma makes it easier, so we don't have to think about making the button not show up for them, because we want people to look at the finding and request stuff, not the collection level records. So, and that's my last slide. So, so thank you very much, and see me if you want more information.
My presentation, as you'll see, will have a lot in common with Benn's, except instead of Primo, we're integrating our ArchivesSpace records into EDS, or EDS discovery layer, which we use locally. This was the original plan, and this is an EBSCO product. But as you'll see, we then decided to go a different route and ingest directly into WorldCat, and from there ingest into EDS. So it's a twisting and complex tale, and it's really happening in real time. It's a bit strange to present on this because we're really just figuring this out, and it's just been happening the last couple of weeks, so I'll tell you the story. So of course the goal is to have our ArchivesSpace records in the library catalog, since for many students we're university archives, and for many students as well as many users in general, the single search is what they use. And if it's not there, it's not in the library as far as they're concerned. So we really want to get these records here. So the first impetus was to get them into EDS. So for this, we needed to work with EBSCO. And so for this, we turned to our electronic resources librarian who manages the databases and has an existing relationship with EBSCO. And so we worked with him to coordinate with the EBSCO implementation manager to put together an OAI feed that would harvest the records from ArchivesSpace into EDS. This was a very simple process. They were very easy to work with. They just requested a few things, such as the kind of metadata. We asked for a Dublin core, and they needed some practical information about how to access the database, what our security was, what our firewalls were, that sort of thing. It was easy, too easy in retrospect, and once we answered those simple questions, they were off to the races. They told us that it would be ready in 4 to 6 weeks. It ended up being even faster, only 2 weeks. So, ready. So this is what we ended up with. You can't see it, but it looked pretty good. It had a lot of the information. It had subject terms, it had the abstract, it had the publisher, it had the collection ID. It could be found and it could be searched, and it had the whole historical note and the biographical notes. You could find really detailed information about the collection from this. There were a couple of weird things about the data, though, which I'll show you in the next slide. So we discovered quickly, once we really dived into what had been harvested, that although the collection level records had been successfully harvested, so were the folders. Each folder had been harvested as an individual item. So we had a lot of really unhelpful records like Correspondence D, Financial Reports 1984. This was not what we had wanted. And in an additional complication, because in ArchivesSpace you can make each individual folder public or private, the local practice had been to make each folder public even while a collection was being processed or while it was incomplete, because to save that labor of clicking on each folder at the end of the process when you wanted to publish the finding aid. So as a result, this was fine in ArchivesSpace because we would just select the collection level record and set that to being private. And then in ArchivesSpace, the entire collection couldn't be found. All of the folders were automatically suppressed if the top level record was suppressed. But because this harvest was considering each folder an individual item, all of those folders from collections that were meant to be suppressed were coming through in the harvest. So this was a major problem. In addition, this was really the major issue with this harvest. There were a couple of other things that were not quite right. There was a publication year that bizarrely just pulled from the second half of the bulk dates and considered that the publication year. It published the accession number, which we obviously didn't want. It indicated online access because it would link to the ArchivesSpace catalog record. It wasn't online, so this was a problem. And we also discovered duplicate records. There was apparently a process that had been discontinued some years ago, but apparently in the past, when collections were finished, they would be handed over to the cataloging department to create a catalog record. And these were very nice. They were very detailed. They had a lot of information, a lot of great subject headings. But now they were duplicates. And because the newly harvested records would be automatically updated as we updated ArchivesSpace, these needed to be deleted. So these were the problems with the original import. We also discovered that the hand catalog records had WorldCat numbers, had OCLC numbers. And we wanted this. In our case, we wanted our collections discoverable in WorldCat. So we wanted to figure out a way to refine our results from the import into the EDS catalog, and also somehow create OCLC numbers for each of these collections. So as we dug into how the harvest worked and how we could make these fixes, we realized that like many OAI feeds, the added information to the catalog would be added to the EDS records every 24 hours. It would be harvested and re-added. But deleted information would not be deleted automatically in this way. Deletion was a manual process, and we would have to work with EBSCO and request a manual reharvest, which essentially would involve them deleting all the records and reharvesting them from scratch. They could do this, but this was a process that they needed to go through, we needed to request, and we couldn't do it that often because it was labor intensive for them. So since it would be so difficult to update all of these things as well as add OCLC numbers to all these records, we decided to start from scratch. So OCLC has a digital gateway, which can import directly into WorldCat, and from there, it would go directly into EDS through our local repository in WorldCat. So this way, the records would be both in WorldCat and in our local repository, dramatically increasing the discoverability of our collections. So here's how we originally set it up in Digital Gateway. You configure it through this, and you can set the repository details down there. This time we had in mind from the outset that we wanted to avoid that previous mistake of ingesting all of folder level records. So we wanted to be very clear that we only wanted the collection level records to come in. However, as we were working with our digital services librarian, who was configuring this feed and working with OCLC, this terminology created confusion since we were telling them that we wanted collection level records, but when they tried to ingest collection level records, it created problems. They saw these levels of descriptions which were drawn directly from ArchivesSpace, but included things like subfonts, subseries, sub-subseries, you know, all these things that they had no idea what to do with. So reasonably, from our discussion, she chose collection. So here's what happened. Well, this is just the mapping. You can see collection here is selected. You can't really see the subfonts is disabled. So since ArchivesSpace uses resource to indicate a collection level record rather than collection, it didn't get any collections. It did pull in about 25 records, which we discovered through the process of analyzing this were actually folders that had been mistakenly miscategorized as collections. So this is all that was coming in, no actual collections. So this was, you know, a seemingly insignificant flaw that ended up being a major problem. Similarly, when we tried to communicate with OCLC, they couldn't keep straight what we were doing. Like, we were telling them that we were working with ArchivesSpace. They kept thinking it was archives grid, archives something else. Like, they could not keep it straight. So we eventually decided the only way to communicate was to set up a conference call with the digital services librarian, myself, a processing archivist, and OCLC. So we were all looking at the same screen, and we could figure this out. So here's how we did it. Here, if you go into the records, this was one of the records that had come in to WorldCat. If you go to this little area, the map thumbnail, the map thumbnail URL field, you click on that, and you get this next screen. These were the records that were coming in. Sorry, next one. Okay, I guess that slide didn't. So, no, sorry, go back. Well, anyway, you get to a metadata map, and from there you can really specify everything you wanted. So that's how we finally were able to say we only wanted resources, not collections, and we could link directly to the correct collection in ArchivesSpace. Originally, the link that was coming in was just linking to the main ArchivesSpace page, but through the metadata mapping, we were able to map it so that the correct link to ArchivesSpace came. And so finally, we're able to fix it. Now the metadata is correct. We're able to really tinker with the mapping so that only the correct things come in, and it goes directly to ArchivesSpace so that they can search the container list. In our case, we decided we only wanted collection level records to come in, and then for container level searching, they would go to ArchivesSpace. So yeah, in the end, we have our records now in the catalog. It's not perfect, but it was a wonky process. But the main challenges were really communicating with other professionals, with our own sets of terminology, and as well as discovering flaws in our own data. And in the end, we managed to achieve our goal of improving access to our collections, especially for the undergrads. And we'll see in the fall what the changes in people accessing our collections. Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Kenneth Claire. I'm going to talk a little bit today about some work that we've been doing at the University of Denver to integrate our archival collection management system with our We're an Ex Libris shop, so we use Alma for bibliographic cataloging and circulation. So we have a need to connect those two systems and get our metadata in sync. So I'll be talking about some of that today. So a little bit of background. We moved to the container management system. We had been using the plugin before it became part of the core code, and then when we moved to the core code, we went with it. Around the same time, it was decided for us that we were moving from III to Ex Libris. So I didn't have to do that migration. I got that one off after ArchivesSpace. But we had a need to make sure that our item level metadata, our circulating item level metadata, was present and accounted for when we moved out of Sierra and into Alma. And then going forward, we use Alma is our circulation system in addition to our bibliographic metadata management system for libraries. So we don't use Aon. We're for the foreseeable future going to be using Alma to call stuff back for work orders or for researcher requests. So not all of our item metadata in ArchivesSpace is equivalent to that same item's metadata in Alma. So we needed a way to try and bring some of that into sync without somebody having to go through and re-enter metadata for the 15,000 item records in our ArchivesSpace database that circulate, although we've still been doing that. So before we could start the work, we needed to talk a little bit about the data model for Alma and how it sort of overlaps and correlates with the data model in ArchivesSpace. So in Alma, there's 3 layers of description for bibliographic metadata and circulating items. So the bibliographic record is sort of the core of how Alma works. That's your basic MARC record for bibliographic resources. The lower level is items, which we've always had. There were items attached to bib records in Sierra when we were in that system. The middle part was new to us. So in Alma, a bib record can have multiple holdings attached to it, and for us, holdings represent the location at which an item lives. You can have more than just location information if you're working with serials or continuing resources. You can mention like enumeration, when something was published, what holdings we have for a periodical, but for us, all that matters for a holding is that it lives either in our building or in our on-site storage facility, and then the item record is the barcoded thing that we call back for requests. These terms don't match up with what ArchivesSpace calls the same thing, so before we could write our first line of code, we had to look at this and try and figure out how it matched up with the way we were managing our containers in ArchivesSpace. So this is what before you try any sort of integration with Alma at all, you have to kind of know this part. Know that what ArchivesSpace calls something is completely different from what Alma calls something. So the resource record that we create in ArchivesSpace is what becomes the bibliographic record in our Alma integrations. We attach locations we pull the location metadata out of the items that are attached to a resource in ArchivesSpace and export that out to Alma as the holdings. And then our top containers in ArchivesSpace are equivalent to what Alma considers to be an item. And what's in parentheses and the squares, that's the native serialization format that Alma uses when you make API calls to it, which I'll talk about in a second. But if you don't specify any kind of format when you request something out of Alma, you're going to get a MARC record for You're going to get a MARC record for bibs. You'll get a much smaller MARC record for holdings, and items you're just going to get a big JSON dump of barcodes and whatever all the other information that it keeps track of for item records. Which one of these is the laser? This one? Okay. Oh, there we go. All right. So there's boxes and arrows that you can't see, but this is all of the different things that you can take advantage of with the Alma bibliographic API. Ex Libris makes available. They sort of divide it up into. The APIs are based on functionality in the system. So in addition to the bib API, there's one for acquisitions and there's one for electronic resources. A lot of things that we don't use in special collections. The one we take advantage of the most is the bib API. And within that, you can get, we use bibs, which is how we get MARC records out of it. Holdings is how we get location information out and then sent back to it if we need to make changes. And then items that's the stuff that circulates. Those are our boxes and map drawers and crates full of building stones and things like that. So each one of those has its own set of calls that either send data back to send data to Alma if you have updates that you want to push out from ArchivesSpace, or if you want to pull circulation histories or work order histories or just the audit trails, and if you want to know the history of an item as it's gone through the Ex Libris system, you can pull stuff out of it and get all of that. If we have a way of integrating that to ArchivesSpace, that's at the end of the presentation. So the way the Alma API does all of this is every bib record has an MMS ID. It's a unique local identifier that when you create a record, ex libris, Alma generates these identifiers, and all of the API hooks are based off of that. We use that not just to get the bib record, but anything that's attached to it, whether it's holdings, whether it's items. You need to know the MMS ID for your resources mark record for all of that. So here's an example. I don't know if you can see that, but that's the URL for the ex libris API call that fetches all of the holdings for a single resource or collection. So that's a call that we make in the plugin that fetches a list of all the locations where we have stuff belonging to the collection with this MMS ID. And if the screen cap I have played, you'll see how that works in production in a bit. So once we had the plugin up and running, we had to then go through and attach MMS IDs for all of our collections we had to assign a user-defined field to the collections to assign an MMS ID to it. So these are some screen captures from one of our collections. So this is the Central City Opera House Association records. So down at the bottom here we have the user-defined section. So this is string 2. We just picked string 2 out because when we were in Sierra, this was what we used for the Sierra's system-generated bib ID, so we just converted it. So each one of our collections that has a record in Alma will have had this MMS ID attached to it. So once we've assigned that field, it used to be somebody had to go in one by one and add that MMS ID to each record. Now the plugin does that for us, so I'll show that in a second. But without this MMS ID, the plugin won't be able to find a mark record, and it'll tell you so when you run the plugin for the first time. There it is. That's the field we use. Can we play that video?
I don't think so.
Oh, okay. Oh, okay. All right, so I'm going to narrate what would happen if this were playing. So when there's no MMS ID, oh, there it goes.
I think you just can't see it.
Okay. All right, so what happened is you enter, in the Alma integrations, I stole all of this code from the top container functionality. So it runs jQuery that the top container search runs. So it's just a linker to the resource search. So you enter your collection ID or your collection title. It gives you the drop down of all the stuff that matches. You click on it, you click the search button, and it makes 3 different API calls. The first thing it'll look for is to see if the first thing it does is it checks the ArchivesSpace record to see if there's an MMS ID on the ArchivesSpace record. In this case, there's not, so it just won't run any of the Alma API calls. It populates, so there's 3 panes here. Bibs are here, holdings are the second one, item records are the third one. Each one of those right now says, so the first thing it says is there's no MMS ID attached to this resource. Would you like to create a mark record for it? It doesn't do that automatically because sometimes there is a record and there's still a few stragglers, I think, that we haven't attached an MMS ID to, and we want to account for that before we push anything out to Alma. And if there's no MMS ID, it's not going to find holdings or items either. So each one of those 3 panes right now says add a bib, do that, then do all this other stuff. So if you do decide that this is a brand new record and needs a mark record in Alma, you want to create it. Oops, oh, I wasn't ready yet, sorry. Go back.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I was ready to move on. So that says update record, I think. So if you click on that, it will run the stock mark export that it just gets the mark record. It calls the ArchivesSpace API to create a mark record. It then pushes that mark record out to the Alma API. It creates a mark record in Alma. Alma sends back the MMS ID for the new mark record that it created. ArchivesSpace then takes that MMS ID, attaches it to the field that we assigned for MMS IDs, and then it'll send you back to the front page and it says, I created a new record, here's its MMS ID, and then that's just on the resource record in ArchivesSpace. So it covers, for our archivist, it's great because they can create a mark record for a collection, have it automatically populate the MMS ID in ArchivesSpace, and then we have a record without them ever having to log into Alma at all. Now I'm ready. So this is, can you play this one too? Oh, there we go. So this is the same thing, only this collection does have an MMS ID. I picked our fourth biggest collection for some reason, so you have to wait for it to load. So here what's happening is, in the bid pane it says we did find a record, would you like to push out changes to Alma? And this is if you happen to know that sometimes we create very minimal records just to get something into Alma so we can get the items out the door, out to our storage facility, but we still have metadata we want to add. So you can, if you know that the ArchivesSpace resource has more metadata in it than its equivalent Alma bib record, you click that push changes link and it'll push all of those, it'll do what it did before. It'll create a new mark record and then send the updates out to Alma automatically. In the holdings pane, what it's doing now is now that it has an MMS ID, it'll query the Alma API for a list of holdings that are attached to that MMS ID. It compares it against the list of locations that we use for special collections and archives. If it finds any, there's a little table right there that shows you what holdings it did find. Whichever locations in our configuration it didn't find are in like a little drop down here. So if you want to add a new location, you just pick it from that drop down list, click on the add link over there, and it'll create a new holdings record. And then this items bit here, this is not at all built out in a way that's useful in production yet, but what it does is that it searches the MMS ID for any item records at all, regardless of location, that are attached to this bib record, and it spits back some information that we keep in the item record that we also keep in ArchivesSpace. Included amongst that is it's the location where the item lives, the description, which is usually equivalent to the box number, so we can kind of match it up with the identifier that we assign to it in ArchivesSpace, just to make sure that all of the boxes are accounted for. Eventually, what we'd like to have is some way to compare what's in Alma with what's in ArchivesSpace. For not all our extent information isn't always the same. The descriptions aren't always the same. So we just want to bring our item level metadata from both systems in sync, which is a long-term project we've had for a while. And my hope is that this kind of helps us out with that. Can I go back one? One thing that's not on the next slide that I wanted to mention is this holdings, the way we know that the locations match up with our locations at DU is because I hard-coded it directly into the HTML in the plugin. This is bad and I feel bad about it, but it's one of the things, one thing I didn't mention is that a lot of what we've done in this plugin is like very hard-coded in places it shouldn't be hard-coded for our use case. Holdings locations is kind of the most egregious example of that, but we do it with, like it's hard, this plugin, it's hard-coded that you're using string 2 as a user-defined field for MMS IDs, so I just wanted to DU it before I kind of encourage people to use it. Or tell me how you would use it and I can make those changes. But right now it's definitely written for us in a way that it probably should not be long-term. Thanks. Yeah. So in addition to what I just said, some of the next steps we have lined up for this are we want to finalize item searching. Alma, the API, when you ask for a list of items, it only gives you 10 by default, so we want to kind of paginate that a little bit so that you can see all of the items and not just the first 10. And we also would like to be able to kind of have side-by-side views of the metadata that we get back from the Alma API and kind of the equivalent metadata on the ArchivesSpace container record, so we can compare and see what's different and which of the two systems we need to make changes to. Some interface enhancements. We just put this in production like 2 weeks ago, so we're just learning how the archivists and the catalogers are actually using it in practice, so I'm hoping that we get some good enhancements and suggestions for improvement out of that. And we don't yet have the ability to pull metadata from Alma. For our bibliographic description workflows, it's fine because we mostly create our metadata. We only need to push most of the time, but once we get down to the item level, Alma's metadata is typically more reliable than ArchivesSpace's metadata, so we would like to be able to pull it out from Alma and make updates that way. Also, Ben mentioned OCLC. Our workflow is to push stuff to WorldCat from Alma. So if we ever get OCLC numbers, we can get it into Alma, but we won't be able to. We have to manually add it to ArchivesSpace once we get a WorldCat, once we get the OCLC number for it. So that's our #1 use case for being able to pull the bit metadata out of Alma, but there are others as well. Some of our catalogers work natively in Alma, so it'd be good to pull from there and not just push. So our code is all up on GitHub if you want to take a look. There's a lot of stuff I had to leave out of this for time that's on the README on the front page if you want to check that out. And also there's my email and my Twitter if you want